Welcome. My name is Andrew Purvis. I'm the General Manager, Europe, Middle East and Africa with the Global CCS Institute, and I'll be acting as MC for this webinar today. I'd like to introduce the webinar to you, and it's one of a series of webinars on key topics that span the CCS chain, which we at the Global CCS Institute are delighted to bring to you. Before we start, I'd like just to kick off with a couple of housekeeping rules. We have scheduled 1 hour for this webinar, and we will keep to that schedule so you can get on with your day. Also, we will make the slides of the webinar and a recording of the webinar available to you via our website within a few days. So I'd like to introduce the topic of our webinar today, which is an incentive mechanism for industrial CCS, exploring the findings of the Teesside Collective's blueprint, which covers work carried out by Societe Generale as part of the Teesside Collective Industrial CCS project based in the UK. We have two presenters and panelists with us today. The first is Mark Lewis. Mark is Low Carbon Manager at Tees Valley Unlimited. Mark has a long pedigree in the process industry in Teesside, having started in 1978 in what was ICI. He spent time promoting lean manufacturing and joined the process industry cluster, NEPIC, which is based in Teesside, in 2006. And it was while he was in NEPIC he became involved with industrial carbon capture in the Tees Valley, setting up PIXI, which is the Process Industry Carbon Capture and Storage Initiative. He also worked on an EU project on industrial parks at the end of 2014, and since 2015 he's been working at the local enterprise partnership Tees Valley Unlimited as their low carbon consultant, supporting and developing the Teesside Collective, which aims to be the first industrial CCS network in the UK. Our second presenter is Allan Baker. Allan is Global Head of Power, Advisory and Project Finance at Societe Generale, where he's been for approximately 6 years. Allan's well known to most of the CCS community. He's been involved in the global power sector for 25 years as an engineer and then in finance, and he's really become a leading figure in the CCS area over the last few years. And he really aims to bring a financial perspective to what is often a policy-based debate. He's worked to support the UK government in their CCS development forum, and he also wrote a report for the Global CCS Institute, which we presented as a previous webinar in 2014 on financing. He's currently advising White Rose, and also advised Masdar on the Abu Dhabi project and the Don Valley project. I'm now going to give a quick overview of how the webinar will work. So during the presentation, you will see a panel on the right side of the screen. If you have any questions, you can type them here as we progress through the presentation, and during the question and answer session I will address those to the panel. I would encourage you to ask questions as and when they occur to you, as this can really add value to the presentation. I'll pull the questions together, and I'm going to ask as many as I can during the time that we've got allocated. Obviously, if we have similar questions, I may put these together and merge them to be efficient and in the interest of time. So I'd like to get started, and I encourage you to ask questions. I'm going to hand over now to our first presenter, who will introduce the Teesside Collective, Mark Lewis.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you can see that. As you've had my curriculum vitae read out there by Andy, so you know where I'm coming from. What I'm going to do is paint a very brief picture of why up here in the Tees Valley in the northeast of England we decided that an industrial CCS network was what we wanted to try and develop. And obviously you'll hear a little bit about some of the work that's been done from Allan in a moment. First of all, why the Tees Valley interest in industrial carbon capture and storage? Well, effectively we're one of the major centres, if not the major centre, for the chemicals and process industries in the UK. We have a very substantial steelworks present in the region. So, not surprisingly, we emit an awfully large chunk of the UK's industrial emissions, and in terms of per capita emissions, we do very well, perhaps in one in one scenario, perhaps not so well in others, in terms of emissions per person. But economically too, the area is important to the UK from a trade and industrial production point of view. We produce an awful lot of the polymer that goes into recyclable drinking soft drinks bottles. We produce probably getting on 30% of the fertilizer that's used in the UK. Obviously, that goes into agricultural production. And if those industries and the steel industry itself could be decarbonised, we'd have make a very substantial contribution to meeting the UK's targets for reducing its emissions up to 2030 and beyond. It's also important we recognise that if we're going to retain these energy-intensive industries in Europe, that we do something about their emissions. They are essential to developing a low-carbon economy. Without steel, you can't have the low-carbon energy network that you need. So it's important we achieve reductions of emissions from those production plants. So economically important area, lots of emissions. What are we going to do about it? And that's why the Teesside Collective got together, and this is a grouping of some of the industrial producers in the area. They really were the first ones to show an interest in it, but all of the producers in the cluster up here are interested in what's going on. But the grouping here is made up of BOC Linde, who operate in the Tees Valley the largest steam methane reformer that we have, making hydrogen. We have fertilizer production courtesy of Grow-How. We have the steel I've mentioned under SSI UK, and we have Lotte Chemical UK that produce the polyester resin for the soft drink bottles and packaging usage. We also have three other partners, National Grid, obviously, who are interested in developing stores and transmission systems for CO2. Tees Valley Unlimited, the organisation I'm with, who represent, I suppose, the industrial development and economic development interests of the whole area, which is made up of 5 local authorities come together to form Tees Valley Unlimited. And then finally the process industry cluster, which boasts somewhere between 400 and 500 members involved with the energy intensive industries in the region. So that's who the collective are. And what have we been up to? Well, we received a grant of some £1 million from the Department of Energy and Climate Change in the UK to look at how you would devise or develop an industrial network. We've done a lot of work on understanding the engineering costs involved with capturing and transporting the CO2 through Emick Foster Wheeler. We've developed a business case, the costs and of capturing the CO2, courtesy of Pale Blue Dot. And the people you're going to hear from today, Societe Generale, Allan Baker, have looked at how an industrial CCS cluster might be funded, and that's what you're going to hear about today. The conclusions of our work show that we can cut industrial emissions substantially. We can support retention of a large amount of economic activity in the region, which is involved with energy-intensive manufacture. It can be done in pretty short order, and really the costs of doing it are comparable with costs of capturing carbon through or reducing emissions through other routes. And in the future, over the next few months, we're taking forward our project ideas, hopefully towards a FEED study and a final investment decision at some point in the future, and we're looking for additional partners to join in the Teesside Collective group. But that's the background to the Teesside Collective, and I'd like to hand over to Allan Baker now to give you the detail of what the work that he's been doing, looking at how a network might be funded. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. I'm sorry, we just had a fire alarm started here, so apologies for any noise in the background. Perfect timing. I wanted to talk through the key aspects of a study we did for the Teesside Collective, funded by DEC and
funded by DEC and BIS. It's a high-level study at this stage, which was to support work also being done by Power Blue Dot on the business case for Teesside CCS project. Go through the disclaimer first. The key aspect of this study was to try to define an industrial CCS incentive mechanism that would support the development of CCS on Teesside. Clearly, the commercialization projects currently being developed by the government are focused on the power side of the emissions story, but there's been nothing so far looked at on the industrial CCS side. Industrial CCS being quite different from power in the sense that the products being produced by the industries are not typically the kind of products where you can pass through the cost of a capture plant, as is the case in the power sector, where the intention is to pass that cost through to the consumer. On the bottom bullet here, I've put the reference for the Dsi Collective Reports, and I'd recommend that people do take a look at those. They're Power Blue Dot reports, very comprehensive in terms of presenting the business case, and it supplements well, or it uses the work that we've done on the incentive mechanism to make that business case. So if you get a chance, I'd recommend going to those reports. So we came up with four, from a short list of around 15 to 20 options, we came up with four mechanisms which we thought would be useful to explore in greater depth to see how they would apply to industrial CCS. The first one is based on a contract for difference mechanism. It's, as I said, the power industry is going to use this contract for difference mechanism, or a contract for difference mechanism as well. But in power, there is an obvious reference price. It's the electricity price in the market that can be used as a base price against which to strike that contract for difference. The challenge we had in industrial CCS is that there is no base price as such. So what we did was try to adapt the existing mechanism to focus on the EU ETS emissions price, the carbon certificate price. Most industries are covered by EU ETS, although many receive exemptions for being strategically important industries or to prevent carbon leakage. But it does give a reference price which is applicable across many sectors or many pieces of industry, but also across the power sector as well to a certain extent. And it's applicable in Europe as well. So the diagram on this slide just represents very simply how that would work in our view. We would see a CFD being entered into with something we've called the CFD counterparty, but likely to be the low carbon contracts company, which is the counterparty for the power CFD in the UK. That money would be received by the Teesside Collective, as we've put it here, but that's the group of industries which would establish this industrial CCS project. And they would use that money to invest in the capture plants required by those plants, and also to pay a usage fee to a transport and storage provider. That usage fee would be used by the provider to establish the infrastructure necessary to ship and to capture the CO2, and they would recover their return through that usage payment. On this slide, we summarise just very briefly some of the challenges and some of the positive aspects of this approach. On the positive side, there is, as in the power sector, a defined strike price. That means that the emitter will know what price they're receiving for the CO2 that they capture and pass on to the transmission and storage provider. And if they're looking for financing, they can offer that as a revenue stream for financial institutions to finance the investment in both the capture and potentially the transport and storage. The mechanism is also self-adjusting, which is something the UK government are very keen on, and they see as a particular benefit of the CFD mechanism, in that if the EU ETS price increases, as people expect it to in the longer term, then the amount of subsidy being paid under this mechanism would reduce accordingly. So offering a value for money mechanism, which is also important from a state aid perspective. As I said, the model is also applicable widely across Europe. And one thing that DEC were particularly keen on was for this not to be just a Teesside model, not to be just a UK model, but to have wider applicability across Europe, which would make it more acceptable to the Commission and potentially of more value to the community. And the important thing as well in this system is that everything is volume based. In the power sector, the power CCS is actually based on a megawatt hour of electricity production, although obviously you're dealing with tons of CO2, so there's a slight disconnect there, and it's quite challenging to establish how that value is passed through, because you're converting from one unit to another on the way. This is paid per tonne of CO2 all the way through the chain, which we saw as another advantage of this system. On the challenging side, this is a project which depends fundamentally on the credit risk of the industries on Teesside. And Teesside has got a thriving industrial base, but clearly an industrial credit is a different profile from maybe a long-term utility credit. So there is a credit challenge within the structure in somebody investing in transport and storage, for example, relying on the conglomerate of industrial producers to be there in the long term, producing CO2 volume to recover their investment. I mean, equally, the industrial emitters are reliant on whoever is providing transport and storage, so it is a circular issue. It's not a credit risk on both sides. And there's a volume risk. Clearly, there are some very large emitters on Teesside, but it's quite concentrated on several very large companies. If, depending on who joins the eventual consortium in this project and how long they're able to supply CO2 for, can make a big difference on the volume that's available for storage. And by definition, the amount of money you can earn under the contract for difference and how much money is available to pay for the investment. And there's an element as well, if you think of deliverability risk around this, because there's something of a chicken and egg situation where the industrial emitters find it difficult to invest in capture plant if they're not sure that a TNS infrastructure is available. But equally, a transport and storage provider or investor wants to know that there is enough volume of CO2 to recover their investment. So there's a bit of a chicken and egg or a Mexican standoff here. And we go on later to discuss how we may break that chain or break that relationship to try and encourage investment. So if we move on to the second model, having identified some of the weaknesses in the CFD model, which we thought was an elegant solution, but to a certain extent challenging, particularly from a credit side, we decided to take a completely different direction or approach it from a different view. And we looked here at a capacity and usage fee mechanism, which we've seen in different sectors in the infrastructure space, in power, in some other areas of investment, particularly on the energy side, and tried to apply this to the Industrial CCS project. So under this scheme, what we see is a capacity fee being paid by the counterparty to the transport and storage provider. That capacity fee is on an availability basis, so as long as they build the infrastructure, they make the infrastructure available, they will receive that capacity fee. And the idea would be that that fee is sufficient to fund their capex or reimburse their capex with a return that needs to be agreed. But it makes them volume independent, so they can make that investment without relying on volumes of CO2 to actually be delivered. It raises a risk of potentially stranded infrastructure, which needs to be dealt with, which we'll talk about later. But it does de-link the provision of that infrastructure from the volume of capture and from the credit risk of the Dsi Collective in this case. The idea would then be that they receive a usage fee, which they pass on to the Teesside Collective in exchange for investing in and providing CO2 to that infrastructure. And again, on that usage fee, there would be a premium, risk premium, to encourage them to enter into those contracts and to take CO2 volumes. Looking at the issues and positive points around this structure, we think one of the very significant positive points is the de-risking that I mentioned. It actually provides an incentive for somebody to invest in transport and storage infrastructure. To be honest, that's an incentive that's missing at the moment, given the risk profile of this sector. But if there was a possibility to invest for a return based on availability, we think that would open up the universe of potential investors in the storage piece particularly, but also in transport. It also enables the phasing of industrial CCS into the system, and this is one of the challenges of industrial CCS in Teesside, but elsewhere as well, in that volumes will not all be available on day one. There's a necessity to phase volumes coming into the system, and this would allow you to do that by the TNS provider entering into contracts as and when volumes are available to buy that CO2 and bring it into the system. On the negative side, there are always negatives. You still face availability risk, and on the transport and storage piece, particularly if it's an availability-based arrangement, any unavailability of that piece of the infrastructure could have significant consequences for the TNS provider, but also for the emitters, for Dsi Collective, because if there was any financial health issues related to the TNS provider, then clearly they would have a knock-on effect to the emitters. So there is still an availability challenge there. There's the EU interface, the EU ETS interface as well. We've disconnected the emissions from the storage, but we've also disconnected the payment stream from the EU ETS, from the certificates. So it's necessary, and this is something that DEC were particularly keen on, necessary to ensure that we're not overcompensating the project within the chain for the capture of their CO2. In other words, so they're not receiving a double benefit because of the EU ETS. There's also issues around price discovery and state aid. Under this scheme, clearly, if you're investing in the Teesside Collective project or developing the Teesside Collective project, transport and storage, if it's linked only to that project, is a single company providing a single service on through a single pipeline. So there may be issues around price discovery and how you establish the various returns for the pieces of the jigsaw when they're put together. And finally, on the compatibility with what I've called the chosen model. I mean, the Power CFD, the commercialization projects are currently proceeding on the basis that the CFD money, or all the money, flows into the emitter, into the capture plant, and is then passed on to the transport and storage provider. So this model, if you like, contradicts that and approaches it from a different direction, which is not an insurmountable problem, but something that does need to be considered. So moving on to our option 3, which we called the hybrid model. We tried to get the best of both worlds with this model. The CFD is quite an elegant mechanism linked to the EU ETS certificate price. It does function well in terms of providing an income to the collective to invest in their capture plant, but we also like the delinking effect of the capacity fee. So this option tries to combine both of those. So the capex still remains the transport and storage capex still remains funded by capacity payment. So that's still an availability-based infrastructure which we made available. But under this scheme, the Dsi Collective receive the CFD money net of that capture investment. So it's only sized to cover their investment in capture plant and a payment then to the transport and storage provider for taking the CO2 from them and providing long-term storage. If we look at very briefly at the issues here, we still maintain the de-risking and the delinking of the two industries, or the capture plant from the transport and storage. We believe it increases the flexibility within the scheme for not just industrial CCS, but a range of other people to provide CO2 into the system eventually, which we'll again come back to later. But it does still expose the project to availability risk. It does still expose the TNS investor to some element of risk on the industry is actually providing CO2, but not to any great extent. But one of the issues here is, I think, the complexity of trying to implement this kind of scheme, this kind of hybrid scheme. And certainly, one of the themes that ran through our work was having worked on a number of CFD projects now and been involved in a number of the negotiations. It takes a significant amount of internal resource for companies and cost to negotiate these contracts, and any additional complexity is only going to multiply the cost of actually implementing these schemes. And again, if you look at the industries, they're largely commodity-based industries, and this isn't the type of project that they're necessarily staffed up to deliver. So, because it's not normal run-of-the-mill business for them. So, we need to keep the complexity. I need to keep the scheme as simple as possible. So, complexity of this was seen as a significant issue here. The last one is, if you like, going back to a common theme, which I've heard a lot in CCS, and that's the development of a true hub. And that's where any emitter can feed into the CCS system. And in this case, we have a steel industry player within Teesside Consortium who have the ability to invest in a clean power plant and could be an anchor project, taking advantage of a power CFD within this system. So they would provide the investment incentive for the transport and storage provider and fund that transport and storage infrastructure. And then we would see the Teesside Industrial Cluster joining into the project through the CFD based on the EU ETS price. And in that way, they would be connecting at conceivably marginal cost to the system, which would be beneficial to the industrial CCS community, but they would bring significant volumes of CO2 into the system, which would bring down the overall cost of the system in terms of the pounds per tonne of CO2 stored. It doesn't have to be an existing plant. This could be a greenfield project, and there are a number of projects around that have looked at combining industrial and power CCS. But the timing issues, on to the next page, the timing issues related to this are quite challenging if you are developing a greenfield project. But as I said, Teesside have the benefit of having an existing steel industry player who could conceivably invest in that type of project. On the positive side, I think, as I said, in the longer term, it helps to ameliorate the risk of CCS volumes, because you've got a power supplier providing baseload CCS volume on a fairly regular basis, so it helps to smooth the intermittency of the CO2 volumes coming from the industrial sector. So we do see this as a valid option to be considered going forward. As I said, it was at the beginning, it's a relatively high-level study, and it did raise a number of issues which we didn't have the time or the resource to address, but there are obvious questions coming out of this. The first one is who pays? Sorry, in the beginning I said that on the power CFD, ultimately it's the consumer that's paying. The money for the CCS projects flow from the consumer through the CFD mechanism, through their bills, to fund the cost. In the industrial CCS world, there isn't the same opportunity to pass this cost on to the consumers. The industry is, not just in Teesside, but if you look around the other industrial clusters, the industries are largely commodity-based industries, chemicals, who don't have the ability in a global market in which they operate, global, very competitive market, to pass those costs through to their consumers. So ultimately, we need to find a pocket to dip into to pay the bill for this. And then there's the issue of who bears the credit risk. And this is an issue which is fundamental to the commercialization projects that are being negotiated at the moment. So it's not just an industrial CCS issue. We do need to establish a CCS risk allocation, which hopefully we will do in the coming months. But the industrial CCS sphere has some additional risks on top in terms of the underlying industries. Those industries typically fund on a relatively short-term basis versus the long-term investment horizon for a CCS project, which has to be 20 years plus. Phasing, again, is an issue we've looked at. I mean, in the Power Blue Dot report, the assumption is that the CO2 volumes are all delivered in a fairly sort of on day one, basically. That's unlikely to be the case. We think that there'd be a need for some phasing. So there is a role, we think, potentially for an aggregator who can go out and source volumes of CO2 with an incentive to aggregate as much volume as quickly as possible. We also looked at the role of the NER 400 funding that's being discussed by the European Commission. And the key thing here, and it's something which I know the collective and we have been working on, is to make sure that the criteria for gaining access to that money actually applies to Industrial CCS as well, which wasn't the case for the NER 300 money. But there is then an issue of how the timing of accessing any money that is available from that scheme to ensure that the most is made from it. But that's certainly something I know the collective are looking at, the strategy for how they approach that when that bidding competition starts. And then finally on here, I've put motivation. Clearly there's a lot of support, and I think probably it's fair to say increasing support since the report from DEC and BIS to try to do something in the industrial CCS space, and certainly these reports have been a good first step on the way. But there is a significant amount of work still to be done, and it's important that the industries of the Teesside Collective have the incentive to do that work and the motivation to do that work, because the nature of the industry is that it's only their investment of time and effort in this which will bring the Teesside project to fruition, but they need the support from government and other bodies in doing that. So just moving on to very quickly the conclusions. Based on the analysis, we could have chosen probably all four options as viable alternatives to take forward. That's not so practical. So what we did was to choose the emitter CFD and the storage-driven model, almost as bookends of what the final solution may be. The development of these two models enables you to switch into either of the other two and potentially some other payment options. But in developing these two further, you address most of the key issues, most of the key structural points and risk allocation points that you would need to bring others, say the hub model, for example, forward at a later date. So these two seem to us to be the best, or the most sensible two models to take forward at this stage for further discussion. There is a potentially a strong case as well for integrating industrial CO2 with a cluster or with a power plant. And on Teesside particularly, there is an opportunity clearly to link into one of the commercialization projects, or at least into the storage facility, as Power Blue Dot have covered in their report, which we think would be a significant benefit in terms of cost per tonne of CO2. So our overall conclusion is that we see several viable models for this. We also believe that Teesside, given the volumes, is a good target. If the government are interested to develop industrial CCS, it's a very strong target for working on that development. The volume of CO2 is significant. It adds significantly to the economics of the projects if you're able to capture a proportion of that volume and bring it into the system. So we see this as a viable project. We believe that it's a project that is worth further investigation, further investment to take forward to the next stage. And with that, if there are any questions, more than happy to answer those.
Thank you, Allan, for your presentation. We'd like now to make a start with some of the questions that we've received. So perhaps I'll start. Mark, there's quite a bit of interest in the future of the project and your timeline going forward. Do you have a timeline for the next phase in particular, when you would move towards a FEED study?
Well, I think from our point of view, there is some uncertainty over that. We I think are going to have to wait for the results of the commercialization work to come forward, which, as far as we know, is likely to come out early next year. And based upon what that tells us, we'd like to be moving towards getting our FEED study going next year. And we originally, if you look at the reports, show a timeline that takes us forward to having a network in place and capture happening by 2025. So that's the sort of target we have, but I think it will depend upon what comes out of the commercialisation programme and also what happens in terms of the UK government's comprehensive spending review that's ongoing at the moment. But our thoughts are, with a fair wind, we would start looking at further work around, let's call it a pre-feed work, starting in 2016.
I mean, clearly DEC are an important part of the mix. I don't know if this is something you're able to comment on, but has there been any feedback from the department on the various models that have been put forward?
Sorry, Andy, was that for me, or?
I think that's possibly for you or Allan.
Yeah. So, Allan, got any thoughts on that? I mean, we've had, as Allan said, had a positive report to the project. I think people are, impressed by the fact that the costs of CO2 capture in industry are as competitive as they are. I think the models, and particularly I think Allan's mentioned the idea of integrating industrial and power generation. I think is clearly of interest, and one that we've always felt here up on Teesside is the way to go. But historically, if you go back, we did have a power generation project up here, but that didn't come through the process, and we've therefore focused back on the industrial network really as the heartland of what we need to establish in the Tees Valley. So I think we see Allan's work as looking at the benefits of having an integrated hub approach as being helpful to re-establishing that kind of approach to dealing with carbon emissions.
Allan, you talked about state aid a bit. Your feeling is going to be possible to agree a workaround or an arrangement for state aid that proves to be acceptable for these early demonstration projects?
I think so. Clearly that it's a very difficult area. Power is difficult, or energy is difficult, but industry is a little bit more complicated because there are different industries operating in different spheres, different competitive arenas. But I think a lot of the thought process around industry has already gone on in terms of the EU ETS and how various industries can gain exemption from that scheme, which in itself is a form of state aid. So I think that that thought process has already happened, but there is inevitably going to be a lot of work to do around that. But it was also one of the reasons I think why we wanted to look at something which was more widely applicable to the European Commission as a whole, to make sure it wasn't just seen as a UK scheme supporting Teesside, that it was something which could be applied to other industries in Europe.
Mark, presumably a number of the emitters in the Teesside region and who are part of the Teesside Collective do receive exemptions, free certificates under the ETS. Given that that's the case, what do you see as the main incentive for them in pursuing this industrial CCS network?
Well, there's a number of issues. I mean, clearly the EU ETS is changing and will continue to change. So I think producers are concerned to understand how they can make their contribution to carbon reductions and maintain a competitive position in the face of potentially at least rising EU ETS costs. The other thing that we've found amongst some of the emitters here is certainly a market pressure on them from their customers and the chains they work into, that they are looking for lower carbon molecules, if you like. Certainly the food packaging industry is looking for that, and there are pressures on our polyester polymer producer to make his product with a lower carbon footprint, and equally on the fertilizer side. I mean, there's a lot of concern about emissions from farming, and if we can decarbonize the production of ammonium nitrate common fertilizers, then that is going to make a big contribution to carbon footprint down that route, and that's something that I think consumers are increasingly concerned about. So it's not just a pressure on from ETS and EU ETS and government, there is I think a growing recognition that the products that we purchase in the for our day-to-day lives need to be low carbon, and that's being reflected back into some of the commodity producers that we have here in the Tees Valley. So, yeah, I mean, I think industry is genuinely interested in that. We wouldn't have kept this collective here together for the period of the study and before that, because the history of this goes back 4 or 5 years. If they weren't really committed to seeing how this might work.
Allan, from your perspective, what's required to take the Teesside project to the next stage of development?
I think we need some commitment from government, clearly, around their intentions for industrial CCS. I mean, I believe that the competition projects or the commercialization projects are going to be really important in defining what risk structure will be applicable, what the government are willing to accept in terms of risk. But they do, I think, in parallel, need to be prepared to promote or to fund some further work on the Teesside Collective to make sure that the project continues, that the momentum that's been built up by the collective is used to continue the development. I mean, I don't think it wouldn't be ideal, it wouldn't be great to sit for 6 months, 9 months, a year before we come back to this project. I think there's enough positive news in the project, enough potential in the project to warrant some investment from government and some commitment to take the project forward, at least, as Mark said, in the pre-feed stage, to do some additional work that needs to be done, just to prove the figures, to give some more certainty around some of the investment plans, and to develop a bit further some of the mechanisms to show that they will work.
Mark, what kind of organisations do you envisage could potentially provide you with transport and storage solutions?
There's a question. I mean, clearly we've had involvement from National Grid in our project, and that one of the potential organisation that might take forward the transport and storage solution. I don't think we've in the collective have really looked at that in any great detail to say who it might be. I think we see the collective as needing to contribute to perhaps a national infrastructure investment as we see it. The alternatives we've looked at for the project are to take our CO2 to the White Rose project store, or to a store in the Captain Sandstone. So, we need to be linked in to whoever or whatever is operating those, and I suppose those organisations are the ones that might want to take on the operation of the Teesside network. I think that we know that it isn't really the business of the emitters in the region to do that. I think that's one fact that is clear, really, is that their business is making steel or petrochemicals. It's not about owning and operating a CO2 storage network. So we do need a supplier of that, and there are the obvious candidates, and we hope that they'll be involved in the project taking it forward.
Allan, you talked about industry potentially participating at marginal cost. Would that imply some form of cross-subsidisation from the power sector? And if that was the case, is that feasible?
I guess to a certain extent it implies some cross-subsidisation. I mean, the intention would be that the power CFD would be used to fund that infrastructure. So it's funding infrastructure which is available for third parties to use later. The other option, which is something we've looked at at different times, is to come up with an access payment mechanism which recovers the cost fairly across anyone who accesses the infrastructure. The issue with that is that you're never sure how many people or how many molecules of CO2 are going to show up in the future. So it's very difficult to define a mechanism which can truly connect people at their cost plus their share of the infrastructure cost. I think it goes back to the point of keeping it as simple as possible. If you can build the infrastructure and recover the cost on a sort of on a base project, on an anchor project, and then come to an acceptable third-party access arrangement for other people connecting at reasonable cost, and that's the best way to go. But I think it's a good way to incentivize. It's incentivizing others to come in. It's conceivably, if the mechanism, I can't go into too much detail, but if the mechanism is designed properly, the cost per ton of CO2 stored is reduced, so that there is an adjustment that gives value for money. So it's not just super profit for whoever's the transport and storage provider.
Alan, does the storage-driven model that you do set out, does that suggest state ownership of CO2 transport and storage infrastructure, if that's the option that was pursued?
It doesn't preclude it. I think we see the storage-driven model as being something which could be applicable to a sort of regulated asset-based type approach, like we see with gas networks or the electricity transmission system, or something which could be, maybe more in the private sector, because we're giving a capacity payment which is sufficiently attractive to attract a private sector investment into that space. I think what we were trying to do, and it goes back to the comments of Mark previously, the industrial emitters don't really want to be involved in transport and storage. They want somebody to take the CO2 away at the fence and not worry about it anymore. But you do need to make transport and storage an attractive investment proposition to try to bring people into that area of the business. One of the I think one of the challenges for CO2 at the moment is that we're not seeing a huge rush of investors looking at the transport and storage part of the market. There is no EOR potential at the moment, or there could be an avenue in the future. So it really is just a waste disposal business, but complicated by the fact it's under the sea and you've got all the offshore aspects. So on the face of it, it's not really that attractive proposition.
Mark, I have a couple of questions on the Teesside project in general, which I'll touch on. Are there options to use captured CO2 in industrial processes as part of the Teesside project, the CCUS element to the project?
We've certainly in the collective thought about that. We certainly see that the fact we've got high purity CO2 from either the ammonia production or potentially from some bio-based production here in the Tees Valley as an opportunity for people to use that. It'd be fair to say that there's nothing immediately out there to use it, and it would probably only consume, at least initially, over the first 10 years or so, a small proportion of it. But we'd actively, if we get the network, then clearly there is the possibility of people getting reliable supplies of CO2 for whatever use purpose they can come up with, ranging from mineralization through to polymer production. It's possible. Some of the CO2 is already used for carbonated soft drink production as a use. So that's one thing we do with it now, although that isn't made in the Tees Valley. So there are already uses in that sense for it, and we'd see the network as providing other options for people to use it, and even longer term into synthesis routes if that technology can be made to work economically. We know we have large amounts of low carbon electricity potentially in the Tees Valley. We have a nuclear power station. We have large amounts of offshore wind. So from our point of view, combining low carbon energy with CO2 in some way to make things is certainly possible here if the technology can be shown to work.
A slightly, I guess, a technical question, Mark. In terms of CO2 with different structures, different sources going into a single backbone pipeline, what does that mean regarding perhaps the quality of the CO2 in terms of temperature, pressure, contaminants potentially coming from a range of different capture technologies and a range of different plants?
I mean, clearly that is a concern. Particularly the steelworks quality is probably different to that coming from ammonia plant, and the other process is a combustion process is based upon natural gas, so they're fairly clean anyway. The engineering work that's been done has looked at those issues and come up. We have a specification from our CO2 into the pipeline, and the costings have allowed for creating that level of purity. So I think, clearly we'd need to do more work on it, and it would be dependent upon the sources as to exactly what you needed to do. But so far, the work done by Emmett Foster Wheeler hasn't indicated it's an insuperable problem to get over. But undoubtedly we'd need to do more work to understand the impact of impurities in the various streams, what we needed to take out, and hopefully that we could arrive with an asset base that had a long enough life to make it all work. We were planning on at least 40 years for the pipeline and the other equipment in the system. So that's been the basis of the work that's been done to date.
Just perhaps to close out, Mark, you mentioned NER 400 as a potential route for the project. The question is, what's your strategy regarding NER 400? Are you planning or hoping to make a future application?
Well, I mean, our intention is to get involved with the process, to try and, in whatever we can, to make sure that it comes out and is favourable towards industrial CCS schemes. I mean, we recognise these are important across Europe, not just for the Tees Valley, and we will be putting our time and effort into that over the next 6 months or so, trying to engage directly with the Commission as to what that program will look like and how we can exploit it, and obviously our desire to have the right membership in the collective to be able to exploit it. I think that's the other challenge for us. But we have some resources available, and we'll be using those over the next 6 or 9 months as we wait for the results of the commercialisation program to engage with Europe as to what is happening on the NER program as a whole.
Thank you, Mark. That brings us, I think, to a neat conclusion to our webinar. I've been able to post most of the questions that we received today. I'd like to close things out by really thanking our panelists, Mark from the Teesside Collective and Allan from Societe Generale, really for taking time both to develop and to deliver the presentation and answer the questions in so much depth. I'd also like to I'd like to thank everybody who's on the call for their participation and really for the quality of the questions being asked. If you did miss any of the presentation, or you have a colleague who missed the presentation or could be interested in hearing it, we will be making a full recording of the webinar with the slides available on our website in the next couple of days. I'm sure you'll join me in thanking our project presenters and for the work they've done that's gone into this presentation. Feedback is always welcome, and this is one of a series of webinars on key products, key topics that has been brought to you by the Institute. If you have any ideas for topics, please feed them back to us via the email address on the page, and also if you have any feedback on the quality of today's presentation. When you close the webinar, you will be presented with a very short survey that we would really appreciate if you could take just a moment to complete. That will help us further improve the quality of our webinar program. On that note, I think I will close out and thank you again for joining us today.